Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Bad Shepherds, the dark years in which the faithful thrived while bishops did the devil's work, by Rod Bennett, narrated by James Anderson Foster. I am the Good Shepherd. The Good Shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hireling and not a shepherd, whose own the sheep are not, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hireling and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the Good Shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. John chapter 10, verses 11 through 15. A cautionary note. This book, like most of my others, has a lot of history in it, but it isn't the work of a trained historian. I'm a history buff, a popularizer, someone whose gifts, if there are any, lie in the tricks of the storyteller's trade, a knack for making history interesting for people who don't usually like history. It's only too likely, in other words, that someone who really knows his stuff might stumble across a howler or two. My only plea? No one else seems to be doing this job for the church right now. And as the great G.K. Chesterton once said, a thing worth doing is worth doing badly. Also, I'd be very sorry if anyone were to take this work as a veiled stab at any modern churchman not yet proved beyond a reasonable doubt to be guilty of wrongdoing. I have no trouble naming names such as Maciel, Law, and McCarrick, nor will I hesitate to pin my term bad shepherd on the tail of any donkey found guilty of malfeasance in the future. At the time of this writing, however, the jury is still out on many unsettled matters, and several popular candidates have been nominated for the title of Bad Shepherd, though their guilt has not yet been proven. That being the case, I've stuck here, as I will continue to stick until compelled to do otherwise, to Pauline counsels on this subject. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls and will give an account. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 17. Pay all of them their dues, respect to whom respect is due, honor to whom honor is due. Romans chapter 13, verse 7. Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. Never admit any charge against an elder except on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 17 and 19. Introduction. When I was young and still a Baptist, my mother worked part-time as a secretary and librarian to a group of evangelical clergymen in and around the city of Atlanta, Georgia. One day she both amused and shocked me by declaring that of these 5 or so distinguished ministers of the gospel, there had been only one who didn't end up being a challenge to her faith. The first had shown himself crass and flirty with the ladies. Another locked the door of his comfortable office every afternoon for a sweet hour of prayer, which was actually a sweet hour or 3 of loud comical snoring. The last had recently become famous on TV and thus acquired a towering Napoleonic ego, leaving his cringing staff to wonder when the Queen of Hearts was next going to holler, "Off with his head." The single happy exception had been one of the Queen of Hearts' lowly lieutenants. This meek little fellow spent most of his time visiting the sick and shut-ins, doing the grunt work his boss was now too good for, drawing scandalously little praise from the big man's flock, and seeking none. He died not long after my mom left his service, broke and disgraced, like his master. I hope nobody will imagine that I've written this book to contrast the sloth and hypocrisy of Protestant ministers with the superior unction and virtue of Catholic clergymen, my own shepherds since a 1996 conversion. I'm pretty sure, in fact, here in the wake of the calamitous revelations of 2018, that not many of my readers will jump quickly to that assumption, certainly not as quickly as they once might have done. Ministers who end up being a challenge to one's faith have now become the Catholic problem par excellence, and the days when we could blithely brush off our scandals of abuse and cover-up as no worse than those of any other denomination are over, whatever modicum of truth that answer might once have contained. In fact, I've far exceeded my mother's old record, having personally bumped up hard for years against one genuine clerical miscreant after another, not just the usual haughty heretics and all too obviously unchaste celibates, but men whose misdeeds eventually forced even today's congenitally non-confrontational authorities to return them, quietly, to a laicized state of life. Many of these personal experiences, if truth be told, were with strange, warped men who made my mom's bottom-pinching Lothario and slumbering contemplative look like quaintly amusing characters in an episode of The Andy Griffith Show. Looking back, I will say that my mom's memorable story gave me a mental category that really has helped through the years: the shepherd who ends up being a challenge to your faith. It gave me a place to hang my hat, so to speak, during such days, a heads-up that prevented me from being caught off guard with no advance notice, much as St. Paul sought to provide for his own converts. We would not have you ignorant, brethren. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 13. Do not be deceived. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33. Understand this: men will come holding the form of religion, but denying the power of it. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 1, 2, and 5. It's this kind of heads-up I'm hoping to provide in this book, however post-dated it may happen to be. For the Good Shepherd has always been served, I'm afraid, by bad shepherds, ever since the days when his hand-picked treasurer, a man who sat through every sermon in the Gospels, began helping himself to what was in the money box. Judas Iscariot, as you may recall, was one of the 12 apostles designated to take the place of Judah or Benjamin, sitting on one of 12 thrones in the New Jerusalem and judging the 12 tribes of Israel, Matthew chapter 19, verse 28. And the office of an apostle is far higher in God's economy than a patriarch, a bishop, a cardinal, even higher than a pope. Yet Judas proved himself to be, in Christ's own words, a devil, John chapter 6, verse 70. Even true shepherds, then, unambiguously designated as such by Christ, can be not just bad at times, but downright diabolical, and worse than you think. Most such notices move quickly at this point to the "even so, the vast majority of our clergy are holy and good" phase, with concerns about tarring the innocent along with the guilty. And though that interjection is certainly true and makes an important point, I'm going to let you wriggle on the hook a little more before moving on. It's my conviction that if more of us realized just how bad our shepherds really can get, and have gotten throughout history, we might, for lack of surprise, be better fortified when these new Judases turn up in our day. Babes in the woods often lose faith after discovering too suddenly that they've been wandering in a fool's paradise. In just the same way, many lifelong Catholics, lulled to sleep by the relative infrequency of bad shepherds like Benedict IX or Urban VI in recent times, may be too likely to expect their ministers to be living saints, rather than cherishing the saints for how precious and few such beings really are. Under these conditions, we are prone to make idols of our shepherds. We may start treating them as a holy caste of spiritual aristocrats, and worse, training them to expect such treatment. Like the opera prima donna or the spoiled Broadway ham, they can start believing their notices rather than staying focused on earning them. And when some of these idols are exposed as having feet of clay, we'll all be a little less likely to lose our heads and go all apocalyptic if we've already lived through the Arian crisis of the 4th century, or spent time with the urbane, ecclesiastical, atheistic bad shepherds hovering round the court of Louis XIV. It's a terrible subject, of course. I think of C.S. Lewis, who wrote the famous Screw Tape Letters, 31 imaginary exchanges between two demons sharing with each other clever advice about how best to ensnare human victims. Of all my books, Lewis confessed, this was the only one I did not take pleasure in writing. Composing a whole volume written from the perspective of a tempter proved dry and gritty work, he admitted, however valuable such a book might prove for training the faithful to recognize the devil's snares. Similarly, I'd much rather have written, as I have done, about the saints and the champions, about heroes such as Justin and Ignatius, Antony and Athanasius, than about the poisonous rats who infest the book ahead. And I confess that I've worried a bit in the writing of it that a book like this might knock the wind out of somebody's sails out there, someone who might be considering the claims of the Catholic Church for the first time, even in this very troubled hour of her life on earth. Or perhaps it might further distress the lifelong Catholic who is now tempted as never before to stop affiliating with this outfit that insists on making such an obvious spectacle of itself every night on the TV news. Here's what kept me pressing ahead. When the Archangel Gabriel announced the coming of Jesus our Savior, he told Blessed Mother Mary, "He will be great, and will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David." Luke chapter 1, verses 31 through 33. We learn two neglected facts here. 1. That Jesus' new gospel kingdom is going to be God's Old Testament kingdom renewed and reborn, and 2, that all of us Christians are citizens of that endless kingdom, the house of Jacob, and even today Jesus sits on a throne that originally belonged to David, king of the Hebrews. All fine and good, but the more you know about the Hebrew kings who succeeded to that throne, the more astonishing these truths become. Out of 39 kings all told, ruling over a kingdom divided into northern and southern parts, 31 were bad, several spectacularly so. Rehoboam, David's grandson, set up golden calves for the people to worship and deliberately caused the civil war his fathers always feared. Ahab persecuted the prophet Elijah and sold himself to do what was evil in the sight of the Lord, urged on by his wife Jezebel, 1 Kings chapter 21, verse 25. Manasseh was a mass murderer who put an altar to Baal in Yahweh's temple and later burned one of his sons there as sacrifice to Moloch. 31 out of 39, and this from a line of kings that God himself had promised to establish and make sure forever. Certainly our batting average in the Catholic Church is, at the very least, a bit higher than that. Of the total number of popes to date, for instance, 266 across a span of more than 2,000 years, fewer than 24 have been mixed up in serious wrongdoing. Meanwhile, more than 90 of them have been raised to the altar for exceptional sanctity, and there's no reason to think the proportions wouldn't be similar in a survey of all other clergy throughout the centuries. The main point to gather, however, from the very unwholesome tale of the Davidic kings is that wicked leaders ruling over God's flock with God's own sanction on their office, but not on their actions, is an old, old story. It's also a profound mystery, of course, not unrelated to the mystery of Judas among the 12, but a profoundly biblical one. And if the bad popes and bad bishops prove, as I myself once believed, that the Catholic Church herself cannot have been established by God, then the very throne upon which our Savior sits cannot be of God, and the religion built around it must be false. I hope you will keep that mystery in mind as you review this similar, often unwholesome narrative. Nevertheless, I don't think I'd have written at all if I hadn't quickly perceived a much more nourishing subplot running side by side with all the tragedy. My research, curiously enough, soon revealed a major key running under the minor, and this was the striking fact that the Catholic laity during the ages under review often shone brightest just when their bad shepherds were at their worst. God, in other words, had not left himself without a witness. They not only survived, but actually thrived, and their heroism finally turned the tide, and their victories were all the more glorious for having been won in spite of their leaders rather than with their help. Soon it began to seem more and more likely to me that our crisis today, when it too becomes ancient history, will probably have ended in just the same remarkable way. This is not just a history, then, but a history with a healing purpose, aimed at binding the wounds being inflicted on modern Catholics by their own bad shepherds. I've chosen to depict 5 eras in particular for this sketch: the Arian attempt to sell Christianity to the Roman emperors during the 4th century, the Dark Ages which followed the fall of the empire, during which Christian bishops and popes too often became half-savage barbarians themselves, the idle and dissolute shepherds of the 14th and 15th centuries, who delayed the universal cry for reform until it was too late, the Catholic rebels who started Protestantism in the 16th century, and the men who drove them to it, and the French clergy who patriotically chose France over Christianity in the 17th and 18th centuries. And if these 5 examples afford us a vision of clergymen no better at times than Nero himself, they also show us a picture equally important in this day and age of ordinary Catholics who kept the faith, for leaders who fiddled while Rome burned. There's a proverb making the rounds these days: when you're going through hell, keep on going. This book, likewise, seeks to take us out by taking us farther in, and with God's help, we may one day join the heroes who won their crowns by outlasting the bad shepherds. Men are never more awake to the good in the world than when they are furiously awake to the evil in the world. Men never enjoy so much the blazing sun and the rushing wind as when they are out hunting the devil. On the other hand, there are no people so dreary as philosophical optimists, and men are never so little happy as when they are constantly reassured. Such men have begun by calling the moon as bright as the sun, but they end only by seeing the sun as pallid as the moon. They have made a shameful treaty with shame, and the mark of it is on them. Everything is good, except their own spirits. Chapter 1. Eyes Off the Prize. The Arians of the 4th Century. Arianism, the Church's direst theological crisis, happened early on. It happened, in fact, to the same generation that saw Christianity legalized under Constantine, and it brought about the first of our 21 great general councils, that of Nicaea. And, though it certainly did take the form of a clash over theology, the colossal Arian crisis of the 4th century was not primarily, as in so many subsequent revolts, a contest between a conservative majority and an upstart group of young men with new ideas. Here, the bad shepherds weren't bad chiefly by being theological heretics, and we won't, incidentally, be defining a bad shepherd in this book purely as someone on the outs with church tradition. No, what happened in the wake of the First Council of Nicaea was a hostile takeover attempt of the Church by duly ordained Catholic churchmen, using a theological novelty as a pretext for pursuing a set of entirely this-worldly ends. Called Arianism, it was a heresy weaponized against the existing Church of pre-Constantinian times, wielded by cynical, non-theological people for a wholly secular purpose, and the body count it left behind was all too literal and not metaphorical at all. The revolt against the Church as she existed prior to Constantine wasn't, contrary to popular belief, made by the emperor himself or on his behalf. The First Council of Nicaea put down the theological novelty and did it decisively by a vote of 311 to 2, a result to which Constantine gave his own wholehearted sanction. Arianism rose from its grave and came to real power only after Constantine's death, and, the Da Vinci Code notwithstanding, Nicaea's affirmations were solidly in line with majority Christian belief for the previous 3 centuries, as anyone at all familiar with the voluminous writings of the ante-Nicene Church Fathers must concede. The theological side of the crisis, in fact, seems to have been precipitated by a brilliant little summation of the traditional view called De Incarnatione, written by the precociously talented young ascetic Athanasius some 10 years before Constantine ever got involved. Here's what happened. During the 3rd century since the Incarnation, the 200s, Christianity experienced such explosive growth, not only numerically but in popular esteem as well, that Christians were threatening to become a majority in the Roman Empire. Christ's sun was rising everywhere, and just when that of the moribund old Roman paganism had begun to enter its final sunset. This meant that Christianity passed through a dangerous phase when it was about as strong as the forces of anti-Christianity. A good old-fashioned Mexican standoff, as they say. When the emperor himself jumped on the bandwagon, however, in AD 311, the scales shifted alarmingly, and though Constantine never did make Christianity the official religion of the empire, contrary once again to popular belief, he did hitch his hopes for Roman renewal to the vibrant new movement and gave it every unofficial and quasi-official sanction he could. Those who, for whatever reason, felt disinclined to join him in the church needed some way to survive and prosper under the new conditions, and their pressing demand gradually began to create its own supply within the Catholic episcopate. Arius of Alexandria, for whom the heresy is named, was a Catholic theologian himself, a priest in Roman Egypt. Young Athanasius had even been one of his deacons. A proud man who gradually allowed his rationalistic bent to run well ahead of his judgment, Arius went off the rails by demanding that traditional beliefs about the divinity of Christ be squared with his own idea of strict monotheism. Arius stumbled, in other words, over what would later be called the mystery of the Holy Trinity. It isn't quite right to say, as you often hear, that Arians denied the divinity of Christ. No, they were always ready to ascribe to him every single godly honorific, all holy, all wise, all knowing, creator of the universe, every single divine attribute but one, that of being fully co-eternal with his Father. Arius's favorite catchphrase captures the gist of the heresy. There was a time when the Son was not. In Arius's system, the second person is a created being himself, a kind of Xerox copy of God, perfect in every way to be sure, but not, as in Orthodox belief, consubstantial with his Father from all eternity. All this to solve Arius's personal problems with the notion of a divine Son, truly distinct from his Father, who is, nevertheless, not a second God. Arius died not long after making a cranky, tone-deaf speech on behalf of his scheme to the frowning delegates at Nicaea. Right at the start of the affair, in other words. The actual heresiarch, then, wasn't the real head of the Arian heresy, and even the Arianism he invented got lost somewhere along the way, modified beyond recognition over the next 5 decades by the political exigencies of the moment. The only reason Arianism is remembered at all is that certain political figures chose that system and conspired with certain Christian clergymen to get it tolerated and then mainstreamed within the Catholic fold. For what reason? Because Arianism, ostensibly Christian though it was flexible enough and similar enough to certain brands of existing paganism to provide a refuge within the new order for unreconstructed Roman heathens. Jupiter, after all, king of the gods of the Romans, had sired half-human sons himself, Perseus, Apollo, and Hercules, and a Christian son of God in some similar sense might be a person to whom the pagans could swear allegiance without stepping too far out of their accustomed thought forms. Arianism was, in essence, the rump of Roman paganism trying to survive in a Christian-flavored form. As such, it was highly attractive to social engineers on both sides of the divide. From the secular point of view, Arianism would ease the transition for the non-Christian population, allowing them to accept baptism and to avow themselves Christian, in some sense, during an era when anything like true separation of church and state had yet to be invented. From the Christian point of view, so-called Arianism might help to ensure that Constantine's bold gambit would succeed permanently. Lacking our historical hindsight, it was easy for our forebears to worry that Constantine might be replaced someday by another, more traditional, that is, pagan, Roman emperor, who might very well undertake simply to undo everything his predecessor had accomplished along these lines, and even renew the bloody persecutions to which Constantine had put a stop. Very well, if Arius wasn't the driving force behind Arianism, who was? Later events prove that the man behind the curtain all along, the shrewd mind behind Arius's bookish one, the popularizer of Arius, Huxley to his Darwin, was a slippery master of intrigue named Eusebius of Nicomedia, not to be confused with his more famous contemporary Eusebius of Caesarea, author of the well-known ecclesiastical history. Eusebius, who was censured for Arianism at the Council of Nicaea, but later wriggled off the hook, was a bishop of Constantinople, the empire's eastern capital at the time. He used his friendship with the emperor's sister Constantia to ingratiate himself into Constantine's household, installing one of his own creatures as the empress's chaplain, a priest tinctured with the dogmas of Arianism. Gradually, Eusebius was able to convince many influential people at court that the whole case against Arius and his beliefs had been a misunderstanding all along, and that the heresiarch had been unjustly condemned. Soon, Arian clergymen began to be rehabilitated and then promoted within the church by their powerful friends. The emperor himself resisted these pressures, never actually repudiating the decrees of Nicaea, but he did waffle on the subject more than a little, especially later in his life when the council's lopsided 311-2 ratio drew steadily closer and closer to 50-50 and beyond. His eldest son, Constantius, however, had no memories of Christianity as it had previously existed, or allegiance to it. He saw only two groups of squabbling partisans within the church, roughly equal in numbers by this point. One very eager to aid the empire in achieving her political goals of unity and domestic tranquility, the other anxious to demand, as fathers in the faith, the emperor's submission to their particular brand of orthodoxy. So, when Constantine died in 337 and Constantius rose to the purple in his place, the new emperor hesitated in this matter hardly at all. He began actively promoting the Arian cause right away, using all the power and prestige of his mighty office, opening the gates of the Catholic Church to a literally unprecedented wave of heretical infiltration. Make no mistake, these Arians were by no means Catholics in their faith, even though they absolutely were full-fledged, regularly ordained Catholic bishops and priests. They were, to put it shortly, collaborators, like the Catholic clergy, a minority to be sure, though not a small one, who signed on to Adolf Hitler's program for a de-Judaified Christianity in 20th century Germany. They actively collaborated with Constantius in his effort to smooth the way for millions of insincere baptisms and for a watered-down Catholicism that might be counted on to play ball with the Roman state. And this illustrates very well the danger of a clergy that takes its eyes off the next world and begins focusing on this one. St. Paul, in recommending celibacy, does so on just this basis, because a married man is anxious about worldly affairs, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided, while the unmarried man is anxious about the affairs of the Lord, how to please the Lord. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 32 through 34. His principle, however, extends well beyond celibacy to all other aspects.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?